On the morning of June 17, 1828, a heavy mist clung to the rolling hills outside Milledgeville, Georgia. The air was thick, humid, sweet with the scent of magnolia blossoms, yet tainted by something far less innocent. Inside St. Augustine's chapel, a small gathering huddled in silence, their eyes fixed on the altar. What they saw that day would never make the newspapers. It would never be spoken of at dinner tables, nor whispered over church pews, because some events are too grotesque, too shameful to survive in the light. There, beneath the flicker of beeswax candles and a crucifix blackened by soot, stood a bride. Her gown was ivory, though dulled with dust from the church's wooden floor. Her face was pale, almost translucent, as though she had been carved from candle wax herself, and beside her, no, not beside, but before her, lay a coffin. Not a simple wooden box, but an elaborate mahogany sarcophagus adorned with white lilies, their petals wilting in the oppressive heat. Within it, under a sheer veil of lace, rested the man she had promised to marry, Thomas Blackwood, a young heir whose name commanded respect in these parts, even in death. His lips, tinged with the faintest shade of blue, were pressed closed in a semblance of serenity. But those who were close enough to see swore his skin bore the sickly gray of something long absent of life. The priest's voice cracked as he read the vows in Latin, his hands trembling as beads of sweat slid down his temples. No music played, no laughter rang through the chapel, only the sound of flies buzzing near the open windows and the muted sob of an old woman muffled by her black veil. When the moment came, when the words "You may now kiss the groom" passed the priest's lips like a curse, the bride stepped forward. Her trembling hands reached out, brushing against the cold flesh of his fingers before lifting the veil. And then, before God, before witnesses, she pressed her lips to his. One guest later wrote in a letter, before it too was sealed away, "I swear on my eternal soul there was a drop of something dark on her mouth when she pulled away. I have not slept a single night since. What drove her to do it? What force could bend a human mind so completely that the boundaries between life and death became irrelevant? Was it love? Madness? Or something far older, something ritualistic, whispered about in backwoods folklore and southern superstition? For nearly 2 centuries, this story has existed only in fragments, a sealed ledger, a priest's confession scrawled in shaky ink, and the rumors that coil like kudzu vines around the decaying remains of the Blackwood estate. Until now. Tonight, we unseal the coffin of history, metaphorically, if not literally, and bring to light the truth of what happened in that chapel. But be warned, this story isn't for everyone. Only for those willing to stare directly into the abyss of human obsession and hear it whisper back. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Would you dare step into a church where the living and the dead once said their vows? Because in the haunted soil of Georgia, love never dies, but sometimes it rots. To understand the macabre union that took place inside St. Augustine's chapel, you must first understand the world that shaped it. Georgia in 1828 was a land of contradictions, verdant and blooming on the surface, yet riddled with decay beneath. A place where sprawling plantations cast long shadows, not only across the red clay fields, but across the hearts of those who lived under their dominion. The scent of magnolia blossoms masked the stench of rot that clung to a society built on silence, wealth, and superstition. The Blackwood estate, seated like a vulture on the edge of Milledgeville, was the kind of house that locals only spoke of in whispers. 3 stories of weather-beaten timber, its columns cracked like aging bones, ivy crawling up its face like green veins. On fog-heavy mornings, it was said the house appeared to rise from the earth itself, like something unwilling to die, and perhaps, in a way, it never did. Inside those walls lived a family obsessed with appearances. The Blackwoods were not merely landowners, they were old blood, aristocracy in a land that craved such titles. Their wealth was whispered to have been built not just on cotton, but on darker dealings, debts collected in ways best left unspoken, ties to secret societies that lingered long after the War of 1812. In the South, the dead do not rest quietly. They linger, they demand remembrance, and in some cases, they demand obedience. This was an era steeped in rituals. Mourning customs were elaborate, almost theatrical. Black veils for widows, mirrors draped in cloth to keep the spirit from getting trapped, clocks stopped at the hour of death. And then there were the whispers, the old beliefs that love could be bound beyond the grave. They called it the binding rite. It was rare, even then, spoken of only in hushed tones, usually by the superstitious or the desperate. But when death came for a lover, some claimed vows could still be honored if spoken over the body, a union sealed in death, eternal and unbreakable. And if any family would dare entertain such superstition, it was the Blackwoods. Their name carried with it not just prestige, but a history of strangeness. It is said that their ancestors came from a line that dabbled in things best forgotten, rituals from the old country, passed down like heirlooms. Perhaps that explains why, when tragedy struck the house in June of 1828, the family did not mourn like others. Instead, they planned a wedding. The town of Milledgeville, though outwardly genteel, was no stranger to scandal. Its cobblestone streets, its horse-drawn carriages, and its immaculate churches were all a facade, masking the sickness that thrived beneath. Power could purchase silence here, and the Blackwoods had plenty of both. The locals might have whispered, but whispers cannot stop a family that owns half the county. And so, in the stifling heat of that summer, preparations began for a ceremony unlike any other, a ceremony the living would attend, and the dead would complete. Before the coffin, before the vows whispered over lifeless lips, there were two young souls, bound not only by love, but by expectations as suffocating as the Georgia summer air. Her name was Eleanor Whitcombe, 19 years old, the only daughter of a family whose fortune, like the Blackwoods, was built on cotton and whispers. From childhood, Eleanor was raised to embody virtue, soft-spoken, obedient, her days spent under the gaze of lace curtains and the watchful eyes of governesses. She was not permitted idle thoughts, except those sanctioned by scripture and needlework. And yet, hidden within her diaries, entries written in faded ink and slanted script, are glimpses of something more, a yearning for a love so consuming it would outlast time itself. If love ends at the grave, she once wrote, then what is the point of loving at all? Entry dated February 1828, discovered in the Blackwood attic in 1912. His name was Thomas Blackwood, 22 years old, heir to one of the largest estates in Baldwin County, handsome, charismatic, and magnetic in the way of men who know the world bends to their will. To outsiders, Thomas was every mother's dream for her daughter, a man of status, charm, and ambition. But those closest to him whispered of something darker, a possessiveness that smoldered just beneath the polished veneer of Southern gentility. Letters found decades later paint a portrait of a man obsessed, not merely with Eleanor, but with the idea of owning her completely. One such letter, written in a hurried, jagged hand, reads, "If death takes me first, you are still mine. Promise me this, before God and before the devil if need be," undated but believed to have been written mere weeks before his illness. Neighbors recalled the couple as inseparable in public, a vision of Grace strolling beneath the sprawling oaks, her gloved hand resting delicately on his arm. But behind closed doors, their courtship carried a tension few could name aloud. There were rumors of arguments, raised voices muffled by thick curtains, of Eleanor's carriage arriving at the Blackwood estate after midnight, her face pale, her veil pulled low. What bound them together? Love? Certainly, but perhaps something closer to obsession. Eleanor, who had known nothing beyond her family's manicured gardens, clung to Thomas like a lifeline. And Thomas, driven by pride, by power, by something almost feverish, clung even harder. There are those who say Thomas was superstitious, fascinated by tales of binding vows beyond death. Stories his grandmother told by firelight, of lovers who defied the grave, of pacts sealed not just in blood, but in breathless devotion. Whether Eleanor believed these tales or simply yielded to his will, no one can say for certain. But what is known, what is undeniable, is that by the spring of 1828, their engagement had become the talk of Baldwin County. The wedding promised to unite two dynasties and cement their reign over the region's wealth. And yet, even as invitations were penned in looping script and ivory lace was ordered from Savannah, something dark was coiling beneath the surface. A shadow creeping toward the altar long before death would cast its final pall. One neighbor, interviewed nearly 60 years later, put it simply, they were too much in love, the kind of love that don't last without ruining something or someone. The ruin would come swiftly, and when it did, it would twist their love into something grotesque, something that would stain Georgia's soil with whispers for generations to come. By the first week of June, the Blackwood estate was awash in preparations for what promised to be the most extravagant wedding Baldwin County had seen in years. Ivory invitations embossed with gold filigree had been dispatched across Georgia. Lace imported from Europe lay folded in Eleanor's cedar chest, and barrels of French wine rested in the cool dark of the cellar. But beneath this veneer of gaiety, something malignant was stirring, a sickness that would soon transform celebration into horror. It began as many tragedies do, with a whisper of discomfort. Thomas Blackwood complained of fatigue, an unusual admission for a man known for his vigor. At first, the family dismissed it as the strain of wedding preparations or perhaps the oppressive Georgia heat. But within days, fatigue gave way to something far more sinister. His complexion grew ashen, his once rosy lips paling to a ghostly gray. Servants murmured of a strange odor in his chamber, faint, metallic, like iron left to rust in the rain. By June 10th, the whispers had turned to dread. Thomas was confined to his bed, his body racked by fever that left his sheets drenched, and his breath rattling like dry leaves in a hollow wind. Eleanor remained at his side, a pale sentinel, dabbing his brow with lavender water and murmuring prayers under her breath. Some said she never left his room, even as the stench of sickness clung to the draperies and seeped into the very wood of the bed frame. Witness accounts, preserved in letters now browned and brittle, describe the progression of his symptoms in chilling detail: blue-tinged nails, as though frost had kissed them, blackness at the corners of his mouth, a bile that stained his linens, eyes that seemed to sink deeper each hour until they were no more than hollows rimmed with bruised shadow. The family physician, Dr. Horace Llewellyn, diagnosed him with putrid fever, a term used in the era to describe a host of virulent illnesses. His prescription was as archaic as it was futile: bleeding, leeches, and purgatives that drained the body of strength faster than the disease itself. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the household staff, rumors of poison. Arsenic, some claimed, slipped into his wine by an enemy, or perhaps by someone far closer. But who would dare, and why? Eleanor, for her part, clung to him with a devotion that unsettled even those most loyal to the Blackwoods. Servants reported hearing her voice long after midnight, murmuring promises in tones too low to discern. One maid swore she saw Eleanor pressing her lips to his fevered brow, whispering, "You will not leave me. Even death will not take you from me." On June 14th, as the sun sank blood-red behind the pines, Thomas Blackwood exhaled his final breath. His body, ravaged by fever and darkened by some internal corruption, lay stiffening as cicadas sang their shrill requiem outside the shuttered windows. The family's mourning was swift but silent. No town bells tolled. No obituary appeared in the Milledgeville Gazette. The Blackwoods moved quickly, as though fearing the stench of scandal more than the stench of decay. His death was recorded in a ledger with two stark words: natural causes. But Eleanor did not grieve like other women. There were no wails, no fainting spells, no black crape drawn across the windows of her chamber. Instead, she issued a single, chilling decree to her mother and the priest of St. Augustine's: the wedding will proceed. And so it was decided. Invitations were not recalled. Flowers were not sent away. Only one alteration was made to the ceremony. The groom would arrive in a coffin. The Blackwoods had wealth, and wealth in Georgia's antebellum society could purchase almost anything, even silence. 3 days after Thomas Blackwood's death, the grand wedding that was to unite two dynasties proceeded as planned. Only now the groom would enter not on his feet, but on the shoulders of 6 men bearing a coffin draped in lilies gone brown at their edges. On the evening of June 17th, St. Augustine's chapel was stifling with heat and dread. Beeswax candles flickered in wrought iron sconces, casting spindly shadows along the cracked plaster walls. Their flames wavered each time the heavy wooden doors groaned open, admitting figures dressed in mourning black instead of festive colors. Invitations had spoken of celebration, yet what filled the air was something closer to sacrilege. The organ did not play. There was no jubilant peal of bells, only the slow, uneven tolling of a single bell that seemed to echo from a great distance, like the heartbeat of a dying thing. Outside, cicadas droned their endless dirge, their shrill cry bleeding through the warped glass of the chapel windows. And then came the procession. 6 men in somber coats carried the coffin down the center aisle, their boots thudding against the wooden floor with the grim rhythm of a funeral march. The scent hit first, lilies intermingled with something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Inside the coffin, beneath a veil of sheer lace, lay Thomas Blackwood, his features arranged in a grotesque imitation of peace. His lips, waxen and blue-tinged, were pressed tight. His hands, gloved in white kid leather, were folded neatly over his chest, as if mocking the posture of prayer. The priest, Father Mather, stood at the altar pale as a shroud, his fingers clutching the Bible with such force that his knuckles gleamed white. He later confessed, years later, on his deathbed, that his voice faltered as he opened the sacred book, that for a single blasphemous instant he wondered whether the devil himself had not crept into that chapel disguised as a bride. And then she appeared. Eleanor Whitcombe, swathed in ivory satin that shimmered like moonlight on water, glided down the aisle as though in a trance. Her veil hung low, obscuring her face, but not her trembling hands clutching a bouquet of roses so deep in hue they were nearly black. Witnesses swore she moved as if guided by invisible hands, her steps eerily measured, her breath shallow. Some said she looked beautiful, others claimed she looked embalmed. The vows were read in Latin, words meant for the living, now uttered over the dead. The priest's voice quavered, skipping syllables as sweat coursed down his temples. His words mingled with the sound of flies buzzing faintly in the rafters, drawn to what lay in the coffin. When the time came for the exchange of rings, Eleanor slipped the band onto Thomas's stiff, gloved finger with the tenderness of a lover soothing a restless dream. Then came the moment that has echoed through the centuries like the toll of that single bell. "You may now kiss the groom," the priest stammered, his voice cracking like dry timber. Eleanor lifted her veil with a hand as steady as if carved from stone. She leaned forward, her face inches from the pallid mask of death, and then, softly, deliberately, she pressed her lips to his. Those who stood close enough claimed the sound that followed was like a sigh escaping a hollow shell. One witness swore she saw a dark streak glisten on Eleanor's mouth when she drew back. Another collapsed where she stood, overcome by the stench rising from the coffin as the lace shifted and a withered bloom of decay unfurled into the chapel's heat. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Only the cicadas outside dared to fill it, their chorus swelling as if to drown the sacrilege. And then, without a word, Eleanor lowered her veil, turned to face the congregation and walked back down the aisle, bride and widow in a single breath. The coffin was sealed and returned to the Blackwood crypt before midnight. The guests dispersed like shadows at dawn, their lips sealed by fear or bribes, or both. No mention of the ceremony ever appeared in public record, and yet, in the margins of the Blackwood family Bible, written in Eleanor's looping script, were found these words, "Till death do us part" was not enough. The wedding ended with no celebration, only silence. Guests filed out of St. Augustine's like mourners at a hanging, their faces drawn, their mouths sealed by more than fear of gossip. For in Baldwin County, the Blackwoods were not merely respected, they were obeyed, and yet no amount of wealth or whispered threats could quell what followed. Secrets, like decay, have a way of seeping through the soil. Eleanor returned to the Blackwood estate that night not as a bride, nor as a widow, but as something caught between. She moved through the grand halls like a phantom in satin, her bridal gown trailing dust, her bouquet of roses blackened to brittle husks. The house, already steeped in shadow, grew darker still. Curtains drawn tight, lamps dimmed to a sallow glow. It was said the very air inside those walls grew heavy, like the staleness of a crypt where something refuses to rot in peace. At first, the whispers were small, servants speaking in kitchens, voices pitched low against the rattle of pots. They said Eleanor locked herself in the east wing, the one overlooking the family cemetery. She dismissed nearly all staff, keeping only a single maid to deliver food that often went untouched. Nights grew strange. The maid, trembling, claimed she heard Eleanor speaking softly when no one else was there, whispering as though in conversation, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping so violently the sound carried through the keyholes like the wail of a banshee. And then came the stories, tales so grotesque they were told only after dark, over whiskey and firelight. A stable boy swore he saw her crossing the yard at midnight, a lantern in one hand and something clutched in the other, a bundle wrapped in silk. Another claimed he glimpsed her in the graveyard beyond the pines, her white dress glowing in the moonlight as she knelt before the Blackwood crypt. When asked what she was doing, he could only whisper, talking to the door. The coffin, some said, did not stay sealed. Rumors spread of disturbed earth near the family vault, as though something or someone had clawed its way back into the light. More than one servant fled the house after finding withered petals scattered through the hall, blackened roses laid carefully along the threshold of Eleanor's chamber, and once a single white glove, stiff, withered, faintly reeking of something that was not soil. Letters from that period, Those few that escaped the fire that later consumed much of the Blackwood archives. Hint at a mind unraveling, they told me vows end in the grave. They lied. He is not gone from me. Not now. Not ever. Undated entry, attributed to Eleanor, found hidden behind the false back of a writing desk. By autumn, the house stood all but abandoned. Ivy strangled its columns. Windows sagged beneath the weight of dust and neglect. And behind those panes, some swore they saw her face, wan, hollow-eyed, her wedding veil still draped across her head like a shroud. Others claimed she roamed the fields barefoot, her gown in tatters, clutching something small and pale to her breast. What was it? A remnant of the man she refused to release, or something far worse, something no longer entirely human? We cannot say, for soon after, Eleanor Whitcombe vanished from the records as though swallowed by the earth itself. No obituary, no grave marked her passing. Only the whispers remained, festering in the humid Georgia air, passed from one trembling tongue to another. Whispers of a love that rotted, and a promise that would not die. For nearly a century, the tale of Eleanor Whitcombe and her ghastly wedding remained sealed behind the ivy-choked walls of the Blackwood estate. It survived only in whispers, fragmented letters, and the fevered imaginings of those who dared wander too close to the family cemetery. But time, as it often does, unearthed what was meant to stay buried. In 1912, the Blackwood house, by then a sagging relic of a bygone age, was slated for demolition. Its columns leaned like tired sentinels, the roof collapsing inward as kudzu claimed what wealth and pride had abandoned. Before the first hammer fell, the County Historical Society sent a young archivist named Jonathan Harlan to catalog any items of significance. He arrived expecting ledgers and legal deeds. What he found was something far darker. Jonathan's notes, preserved in the archives of the Georgia Historical Review, read like the opening pages of a Southern Gothic novel. This house feels less abandoned than watchful. Dust lies thick, yet the mirrors remain draped in black, a superstition, or mourning left unfinished. Extract Harlan Field Journal, June 6, 1912. Inside the east wing, Eleanor's wing, Harlan discovered a writing desk with a false back. Hidden within were pages bound in ribbon, their edges brittle, ink faded to the color of dried blood. It was Eleanor's diary. At first, her entries were the musings of a sheltered young woman, reflections on dresses, sermons, and the promise of love. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Words grew frantic, looping into near illegibility. They tell me he is gone, but I feel him still, in the hush before dawn, in the walls that breathe when I speak his name. Undated entry. Worse still were the later passages. Written in what appeared to be a trembling hand, the priest said vows end at death. Lies. We are beyond vows now, beyond breath. He comes when I call. But the most chilling find was not the diary. It was what Jonathan uncovered in the family crypt. Local workers, tasked with clearing overgrown brush, reported that the heavy iron door had been pried open, years, perhaps decades before. Inside, the stone slab meant to bear Thomas Blackwood's coffin was empty. In its place lay remnants, fragments of satin, a withered bouquet, and a single leather-bound Bible. On its flyleaf in Eleanor's unmistakable hand was scrawled, "Till death do us part was never my promise." Harlan's discovery made the papers briefly, though never in full. The official story spoke only of curious artifacts of Southern aristocracy, omitting the diary's contents and the missing body. Yet in private letters to a colleague, Harlan wrote, "I fear we have stumbled upon a union not broken by earth nor sanctified by heaven. Whatever Eleanor sought in those rituals, I pray it never answered." Letter dated August 1912, held in private collection. And then, as abruptly as he appeared, Jonathan Harlan vanished from public record. Some say he returned to Boston. Others claim he became obsessed, tracing the Whitcombe lineage, sending frantic telegrams to obscure occult societies. His final surviving note, scribbled in the margin of Eleanor's diary, reads like a warning. There are pages missing. God help us if someone finds them. Today, those pages remain lost. Some believe they were burned when the Blackwood house caught fire in 1934, its ruins glowing like embers of a cursed past. Others insist they were stolen, kept hidden by those who fear what they contain. But one question has gnawed at historians for decades. If Thomas Blackwood's coffin lies empty, where did he go? Or worse, who moved him? Time has a way of burying stories, but some roots grow so deep they push back through the soil. What began as whispers in a sweltering Georgian summer became legend, then a dark inheritance that still clings to Baldwin County like Spanish moss. Ask anyone in Milledgeville about the Blackwoods, and you'll see their faces shift, curiosity mingled with unease. Most will tell you the house is gone, reduced to ash after the fire of 1934. But a few will lower their voices and say the ruins still breathe when the wind moves right. That if you stand at the edge of the overgrown lot, where kudzu now strangles the memory of grandeur, you'll hear the faint toll of a bell. One ring, then silence. Locals call it the bride's toll. Some claim to have seen her, a woman in a rotting gown drifting between the pines, her veil trailing like smoke. Hunters speak of finding footprints in the damp soil near the old Blackwood crypt, barefoot, delicate, as though made by someone still wandering after nearly 2 centuries. And then there's the crypt itself. Sealed, yes, but the iron door bears scratches now, deep grooves like something clawed its way out or tried to claw its way back in. But the strangest accounts come not from the woods but from those who inherit the bloodline. Distant descendants of the Whitcombes and the Blackwoods tell of dreams that taste like earth and iron, of voices whispering vows in the dead of night. One letter sent anonymously to the Georgia Folklore Society in 1978 reads, "My grandmother said we do not marry in June, we do not wear lilies, and we never, never speak his name." Even now, fragments of Eleanor's diary surface in private collections, tattered pages, edges singed as if from fire. The handwriting is frantic, the words almost feral. The priest said, "God will not hear me," but there are other ears, and they answer when I bleed. Does it suggest ritual, resurrection? We cannot know. Those missing pages, the ones Jonathan Harlan feared, have never been recovered. Or so they say. The legend refuses to die because it feeds on something universal, the terror of love unbound by death. The Blackwood tale reminds us that obsession is not devotion, it is hunger. A hunger that does not end when breath does. A hunger that devours, even as it claims to cherish. And perhaps that is why the old cemetery draws the curious even now. Paranormal groups, thrill seekers, lovers daring one another to touch the rusted iron gate. They leave offerings, bouquets, rings, sometimes a single white glove, yellowed with age. And sometimes when the moon is swollen and the air drips heavy as honey, they hear her. A woman's voice, soft and cracked as old paper, whispering through the pines. "Till death do us part" was never my promise. Sound design suggestion, crescendo of cicadas, then abrupt silence, followed by faint whisper layered under final line. And so the story ends where it began, in the sweltering dark of Georgia's forgotten plantations, where love turned sour, vows turned blasphemous, and one bride walked so far into madness she left footprints on history's throat. Whether Thomas Blackwood rests in peace, or rests at all, remains a question Baldwin County will never answer aloud. But if you ever find yourself driving the back roads near Milledgeville on a summer night, slow down when you see the pines. Listen for the bell, and whatever you do, if you hear a voice calling your name from the dark, don't answer. Was this just the madness of a grieving woman, or did Eleanor truly bind herself to something beyond the grave? Drop your theories in the comments, and if you've heard other stories from Georgia's forgotten plantations, share them. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales like this, because some histories refuse to stay buried.